So we're going to be discussing processing the grief of your loved one's diagnosis and the life that you thought you'd have. I'm looking forward to discussing the various stages of grief with you today and how it can show up along the myeloma journey. I want to clarify, I am not a mental health professional. This is meant to be a helpful educational presentation and discussion and should not be considered medical advice. However, I do have this special privilege and opportunity to share moments with myeloma caregivers and patients in their journeys on a daily basis. Often I meet with myeloma caregivers who are feeling guilty for experiencing feelings of grief, or others who don't recognize the feelings of grief that are overwhelming them. Again, my hope is that throughout this presentation and discussion, you're able to gain knowledge and connection with others who are experiencing the same things as you in their own way. So thank you again for being here. I will end that poll and share the results with you. It looks like the majority of us are the majority of you are either a caregiver to your spouse or partner. I do have a couple that are, one of you that is a caregiver to your parent, and then 4 of you who are the patient. Thank you for being here no matter who you are, and I really look forward to sharing this night with you. So let's start with just talking about what grief is. And again, this might be redundant to some of you who are already well aware, and there are even some of you out there that could probably speak to it better than me. But hopefully we can learn from each other tonight. So grief is universal, and at some point everyone is going to have at least one encounter with grief. It can come from any change that alters life as you know it. For example, a myeloma diagnosis of your loved one. And grief is also really personal. It's not linear. It can look differently in different people. It doesn't follow any timelines. It doesn't have any schedules. You can cry, become angry, withdraw, feel empty, and none of these things are unusual or wrong. These feelings may also come throughout the myeloma journey as you and your loved one are experiencing different things, and it may be at diagnosis, or it may be when they reach complete response and you think, what am I going to do now? And when is it going to come back? Or it may be when they are relapsing. Everyone grieves differently. So if you don't cry, it doesn't mean that you aren't grieving. Crying is a normal response to sadness, but it's not the only response to sadness. And those who don't cry may feel the pain just as deeply as others. They may simply have other ways of showing their pain. If you do cry as a part of your grief, it doesn't mean that you're weak. You don't have to be strong in the face of losing the life that you thought you were going to have with your loved one. And you don't need to protect your family and friends by putting on a brave front when you decide to tell them what you are going through, if you do decide. We're going to be talking about the 5 stages of grief from the Kubler-Ross model, and there are 5 stages in this. There are some commonalities in the stages and perhaps in the order of the feelings experienced during the grief. They are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And we're going to talk about each of these stages today and provide examples of how these could look like in grieving your loved one's diagnosis or the life that you thought you'd live. The first one is denial. We're going to focus first on denial, which is often known as the first stage of grief. Grief is such an overwhelming emotion, and it's not unusual to respond to the strong and often sudden feelings by pretending that change is not happening. For example, I've met many caregivers who who find it really hard to accept the diagnosis of their loved one, and they might deny the severity of the illness. Denying it gives the person time to more gradually absorb the news and begin to process it. It's a common defense mechanism and helps numb the intensity of the situation. However, the issue comes, and we're going to touch over this briefly throughout the discussion today. The issue comes when people try to stay in that phase and don't let themselves naturally move on in order to avoid the overwhelming feelings that might come in future stages of grief. So I, for example, knew a man who was in complete denial of his wife's diagnosis and was so scared of what the future might look like that he told people the doctor had messed up the diagnosis and that she didn't have multiple myeloma. Now, this isn't to badmouth this man. It was simply his reaction to grief, but it made it really hard on the myeloma patient who was experiencing this reaction from her husband. Other examples of denial that myeloma caregivers have shared with me over the past 2 years, and obviously these are completely anonymous, reactions have been, this isn't happening to us. The results are wrong. It's not that serious of a condition. This was somebody who had high-risk smoldering myeloma. Their partner had high-risk smoldering myeloma. It's not a serious condition. We don't need to do anything about it. And then another reaction, the doctor will call us back and say he got mixed up with another patient. There is no way that I put my name, because obviously I didn't want to disclose who this was. There's no way that Audrey is relapsing, or things will get back to normal soon. Now, it's important to note that denial is completely refusing to deal with the problem at hand, and optimism is something that's entirely different and should not be confused with denial. So you could turn that to say, you know, the one where they were talking about the high-risk smoldering myeloma. It's not a death sentence. We can do this together. You know, that's optimism. Denial is saying, we don't have to do anything about it. This isn't real. And so another reason why I want to share these examples is because I want to validate other people's journeys. I'm not doing this as to be accusing. I want it to be reading these and, wow, I resonate with some of those, or I'm so glad to know that I'm not alone. It doesn't make you a bad person to experience these things or to have these thoughts as part of the myeloma journey that you are going through with your loved one. So the second stage of grief is known as anger, and anger is a natural feeling that can follow denial. It's okay to feel anger when you're grieving, and this is an intimate process and you have the right to experience it fully. Brandon Stanton, who's a PhD board certified counselor, said, most people feel both sadness and anger during the grieving process, but for many people, anger is such a strong emotion that it overshadows other emotions such as sadness. And some people may be more prone to anger during grieving due to genetic, personality, or experiential factors. Some examples of anger that I've heard from myeloma caregivers over the years has been, why is this happening to me? And how could this happen to me? Why didn't the doctors catch this before? How was the other misdiagnosis possible? Why did no one ever tell me about myeloma and what to watch for? Why didn't I recognize the symptoms in my loved ones sooner? What am I supposed to do with my life now? And there goes our retirement savings. Life will never be the same again. Again, I share these examples so that you know if you've ever thought one of these phrases or questions, and if any of them resonates with you, there's nothing wrong with you. It's a complete natural and normal reaction. The issue, again, comes when somebody decides to stay in one of those stages of grief, or by no choice of their own stays in that stage of grief and becomes unable to move on from that stage over time. The third stage of grief is known as bargaining. So during the grief of your loved one's diagnosis, you might feel vulnerable and helpless. In those moments of intense emotions, it's not uncommon to look for ways to regain control or to want to feel like you can affect the outcome of an event. In the bargaining stage of grief, you may find yourself creating a lot of what if or if only statements. It's also not uncommon for religious individuals to try to make a deal or promise to God or higher power in return for healing for their loved one or relief from the burden that they're carrying. Bargaining is a line of defense against the emotions of grief. It helps you postpone the sadness, confusion, or hurt. Examples of bargaining in myeloma journeys that people have shared with me are, if only we had eaten more healthy, this wouldn't have happened to him. What if I had encouraged her to exercise more? Would this have happened? If we had only gone to the doctor sooner, we could have stopped this. If I learn everything that I can about myeloma, I can save their life. What if we hadn't lived in that neighborhood near the chemical plant? And I chose to change it to chemical plant That is not a known diagnosis of myeloma or cause of myeloma, but hopefully you get the gist of what I'm trying to say there. Would things have been different? Again, if one of these resonates with you, take comfort in that you're not alone. The fourth stage of grief is depression. Now, this is one we're going to spend a little bit more time on because there's a distinct difference between grief depression and those who are diagnosed with clinical depression, which we are also going to discuss because it's important to acknowledge them and make sure that people are getting the help that they need. It is not uncommon to have people get stuck. We kind of talked about people getting stuck in denial, people getting stuck in anger. It's not uncommon to have people get stuck in this stage and have a hard time leaving it. However, we're going to learn again about the realities and differences of this complicated stage of grief. Anger and bargaining can feel like the very active, loud stages of grief. And on the other hand, depression can feel more quiet. In the early stages of diagnosis or relapse, you may be running from the emotions, unable to process them due to the load that has been handed to you by as a caregiver, or simply just overwhelmed with life. By this point in your grieving journey, however, you may be able to embrace and work through these feelings in a healthier manner. You may also choose to isolate yourself from others in order to fully cope with the significant change that has happened to you and your family. Depression may feel like the inevitable landing point of loss. However, if you feel stuck here or can't seem to move past this stage of grief, you need to talk with a mental health expert. The social worker at your loved one's specialty center or the cancer resource center in your area, hopefully you have access to those. And if not, you can contact our team and we'll try to help you find one in your area. But they should be able to direct you to proper care. A therapist can help you work through this period of coping. Diagnosed depression is a serious illness that affects body, mood, thoughts, and behavior. It affects the way a person eats, sleeps, and thinks. If you have persistent, sad, anxious, or empty moods, are sleeping too much or too little, I would guess too little, have persistent guilty, hopeless, or worthless feelings, or significant fatigue and loss of energy, please seek appropriate help because you matter. Again, I want to discuss awareness of what might happen when you need help. And depression is intricately tied into your grief. Symptoms of depression can vary from person to person, but anyone who has been experiencing 5 or more of the following symptoms for more than 2 weeks should see their doctor. Again, persistent, sad, anxious, or empty moods, sleeping too much or too little, change in appetite resulting in gain or loss of weight, loss of pleasure and interest in activities you once enjoyed, irritability, restlessness, crying too often or too much, aches and pains that don't go away when treated, difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions, fatigue or loss of energy, feeling guilty, hopeless, or worthless, and thoughts of death or suicide. Those sensitive, these are some examples that I've heard from people dear to me who share their vulnerable experiences with me when depression sets in and they're feeling completely overwhelmed. Our life has come to a terrible end. I will never be the same again. I am too overwhelmed. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep this up. It might be time for me to give up. Now, I have included in the resources section the suicide hotline if any of you are experiencing those feelings. And I also, again, even though this is deep and hard to talk about, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that you might be going through this as your loved one is being diagnosed, relapsing, or you're just simply feeling overwhelmed with the unknown that might come when your partner or parent is in remission or complete response, as we call it in myeloma. The fifth and final stage of grief is acceptance. So it's important to note that acceptance is not necessarily a happy or uplifting stage of grief. It doesn't mean that you've moved past grieving the life that you thought you'd have with your loved one. It does, however, mean that you've accepted the diagnosis or relapse or new life habits or activities that you might have to adjust to and have to come to understand what it means for your life now. You may feel very different in this stage, and that's entirely expected. You've had a major change in your life, and that upends the way you feel about many things and the way that you see the world. Look to acceptance as a way to see that there may be more good days than bad, and there's still going to be bad, and that's okay. Some examples of acceptance might be, life may not be the same, but it's still wonderful. There are so many things that we are still able to do. This diagnosis may affect us, but it does not have to define us. What opportunities do I have to serve others in my same position? I am so fortunate to have had so many healthy years with my loved one, and there are still so many memories yet to be made. Those are positive acceptance examples that I've heard from myeloma caregivers in our community. As you can see, this is the stage where we all strive to be, a place where hope and optimism can exist, along with a healthy dose of realism. I also want to mention, as I finish up this presentation, and then we can discuss together, some more thoughts to remember when considering the stages of grief in the order that they may or may not come in. No one goes through the stages of grief in a linear way. You may have ups and downs and go from one stage to another and then circle back. Additionally, not everyone will go through all stages of grief that I just mentioned, and you may not go through them in order. For example, you maybe have coping with your pain in the bargaining stage and then find yourself in anger or denial next. Some last thoughts on grief. The philosopher Cornel West shares, grief is the part of the human experience. It's recognizing diminishment in your life while simultaneously recognizing the opportunity grief gives you of empowerment. Strangely enough, grief can give you something to be thankful for in every circumstance. You can acknowledge your pain and still see beauty. And these are the resources that I used to create the content